One of the most famous quotes in video game history comes from Shigeru Miyamoto in 1996 when the Nintendo 64 was delayed so that they can put more time into working on Mario 64. And the quote goes like this: "A delayed game is eventually good, but a rush game is forever bad." And I think the reason why that quote is so powerful is because of how amazing Mario 64 was, that you would think that if the game did not get delayed, if they just rushed it to market, the entire gaming industry might be different, completely different today than it is right now, because Mario 64 was a generation-defining game. It was really the game that defined 3D gaming. It was the first of its kind, and it's considered by many to be one of the greatest video games of all time. And I can guarantee you Mario 64 would not have the same legacy that it does today if it did not get the extra time and attention that it got through delays. If they rushed it instead of giving it the time it needed, maybe the game would have been a buggy mess. Maybe it wouldn't have had as many features as it ended up having in the final release. The thing about delays is I understand why people get frustrated by it, because the developers or publishers, they promise a specific time and date when a game is supposed to come, and when they're not able to deliver upon that promise, people get pissed off. And I completely understand where they're coming from, especially in the case of Cyberpunk. It was ridiculous. The game was announced originally to be released in April, then it got delayed to October, then November, then it was certified gold, and then it was delayed again. So Cyberpunk was a weird case, and then of course, we all know what happened when it actually got released, is that maybe it could have used a few more delays, because even on PC, there are a lot of very noticeable bugs that can have a negative impact on your gameplay experience, to the fact that I really don't want to even touch Cyberpunk at this point. I'm going to wait until it's on sale, and when it's like a few years after it's out, when all the bugs are kinked out, because I don't care about buying games at launch these days, especially in the age of a live service, where they could just release a broken game now and fix it later. I don't want to deal with that shit, where I spend $60 and have to wait for the game to eventually be good. Fuck that. And I know there are a lot of people that are enjoying Cyberpunk regardless of the issues that are going on with the game right now, and that's good for you. I'm glad you're having a good time, but I think it's safe to say that the game could have used another delay. And I know a lot of people get pissed off when they hear that, because the game already got delayed like 4 or 5 different times, and another delay that probably would have killed the hype for the game at that point, or at least it would have caused some serious problems for CD Projekt Red as far as, getting actual sales, because the game keeps getting delayed. People are going to wonder if the game's ever going to come out, right? So obviously there's a lot of things at play. It's not just people getting angry about the delay. It's not just about whether or not the developers think the game should get delayed. It's all a financial decision. CD Projekt Red, they promised their investors a good return in the fourth quarter, or whatever quarter it was, where the holiday season is, and they had to deliver on that. And the holiday season is where most of the financial activity happens in the video game industry, or at least it's the most active season in the gaming industry. So if a game gets released and it avoids the holiday season, that could be a detriment to the game's sales, and it could definitely have a negative effect, at least on the stock prices and all that. And, to the average person, like to the consumer, obviously we don't care about stock prices. Obviously we don't care about what the investors think. But obviously the people in charge of management do care, because they need capital in order to fund future projects. So it's not a simple yes or no, should a game get delayed, should it not get delayed. But I will say in the case of Cyberpunk, they probably would have been better off with a delay, considering what's going on with Sony actually getting rid of the game, taking the game off the PlayStation Store, and offering refunds. That's not good. They could have at least released the PC version earlier than the console version, or do something, because what they ended up doing ended up biting them in the ass. So I don't even think that's ever happened in video game history, where a AAA game gets taken off the PlayStation Store, the Xbox Store, and the console manufacturer actually has to step in and say, no, this game is too bad, like, it's not in a playable state, we need to give out refunds. I don't even think that happened with Battlefield 4, and that game was straight up broken at launch. So it was really bad for Cyberpunk. That game obviously had a lot of issues for Sony to go through with that. So yeah, obviously, like, it's definitely a calculated risk one way or the other if a publisher decides to delay the game and put it off, because the hype can die down, and less people are going to be interested in the game the longer it gets delayed and the longer it takes. Although in the case of Cyberpunk, there was a lot of hype because it took 8 years to develop the game. But I think at that point, I mean, the more delays it would have gotten, it definitely would have killed the game's momentum a little bit. And CD Projekt Red was definitely concerned about that. But on the other hand, CD Projekt Red not delaying the game until, like, let's say spring 2021, that also costs them a lot, especially with the stuff going on with Sony right now. And I think the only reason why it hasn't been taken off the Xbox store is because of the marketing agreement between Microsoft and CD Projekt Red. But they're also talking about potential lawsuits between CD Projekt Red and certain partners that felt like they were misled as far as the quality of the game is concerned. We'll see how that goes. I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but we'll see. But, so yeah, I mean, delaying a game, it definitely has its benefits and risks associated with it. And maybe it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, like, oh, a game should always be delayed if it's not ready. And it's also, like, worth noting that video games are complicated pieces of software, right? So they can say that a game is going to take however long it's going to take, and they end up underestimating how long it's going to take because something can always come up with the development of a game. It's not as simple as just punching in a few lines of code, designing a game. Like, there's so much to developing a video game. Anyone watching this video that's a video game developer, you can definitely attest to that. It's not a very simple thing. It's definitely a lot more complicated than making a movie or writing a song or any other type of art form. Video games are so complex, right? So, yeah, they could say the game's going to come out in a year from when they announce the launch date, but a lot of issues might come up in between that time that they have no control over whether or not they can delay the game, because they can't release the game in the broken state that it will be in if it comes out. But on the other hand, if they delay the game, it'll piss people off. But I think delaying a game is ultimately, like in most cases, the better scenario. Especially a game like Cyberpunk that had so much hype, and the longer it takes for the game to come out, the more hype there is. And if, like, the thing about Cyberpunk is that they did have so many delays, and it turned out to be shit regardless. I'm not saying the game is shit, but it was a shit show with all the bugs and glitches it had. So the fact that it had all those delays and people, the expectations were even higher that the game was going to be a very high quality product and not have a lot of issues. Yeah, that's a big problem. That's not sustainable in the long term for them to have all these promises, to have all these ambitions, and to hype the game up so much, and then when the game comes out, it doesn't deliver. And I think a lot of people will keep that in mind when CD Projekt releases their next game, whatever that may be. Maybe it's another game in the Witcher series, maybe it's a new IP, I don't know. People are going to remember Cyberpunk. Regardless of whether or not the game gets fixed, and I'm sure it will get fixed, people still aren't going to forget what the game was like when it came out. People are not going to be at a rush to buy your next game at launch because they remember what happened when they bought Cyberpunk at launch. But let's actually look at the quote at face value. Shigeru Miyamoto's quote that a delayed game is eventually good. We do know that that's not always the case. Never mind Cyberpunk, because you could say that it's a good game even though it has a lot of bugs, at least on PC. You can't make that case on the PS4 and Xbox One. It's just a broken mess. But there are games that get delayed or have such a long development time. They're just fundamentally not good pieces of software. It doesn't matter how much delays it gets, it's just a pile of shit. Duke Nukem Forever is the best example. The game was in development hell for like 13 years, and just because it was in development for 13 years doesn't mean that it was a good game. You know what I mean? Like a good example I can think of a game that you could say was rushed because it was only a year after the original. Star Wars Battlefront 2 came out a year after Battlefront 1 and is considered one of the greatest games of all time. Never mind Star Wars games, considered one of the greatest games of all time. And it only took them a year to work on it. So it's not always about how much time it takes to make a game. Like, it's not a science that longer development time equals better game, although on surface level that might make a lot of sense considering that when a lot of games are rushed, they don't turn out very well. But when I think of games like Battlefront 2, Fallout New Vegas, games that really didn't take that long to make, it took less than 2 years to develop. You can make the case that it really doesn't matter if you delay a game, it really comes down to the vision that the game has, and that could be fundamentally flawed, and that could be why the game does not deliver on its promises, because they just couldn't do it. Again, video games are very complicated pieces of software. They can have a vision for a game in their head, these developers, but when it actually comes to programming it into software, it doesn't always translate well, right? But I think what makes Cyberpunk so frustrating and other games is that you could tell that the game does have so much fucking potential, right? Like, if they did delay the game, if they just fixed the bugs and made sure that it was ready to be released before they announced the release date, because that's another thing, man. Like, okay, I think the good thing to contain the hype and to make sure this problem doesn't exist, like, so when developers, when they delay a game, they get really pressured. There's so much pressure for them not to delay it again because they already delayed it. And then especially with Cyberpunk, they delayed it 3 times. So what were they going to do? Delay it again? I mean, I think they should have, but that's not just an easy decision to make. Like, oh yeah, we'll just keep delaying it and delaying it and delaying it and delaying it. Like, that has a lot of negative financial implications to it, especially when we're talking about investors who expect a return on their investment. It ended up backfiring with CD Projekt Red, but that is still something to consider. And of course, you could also make the case that the entire philosophy around the design of Cyberpunk on last-gen consoles held back the PC version, and that caused a lot of problems, and that's why the game got delayed so much, because they tried to make it work on old hardware that it really didn't work. No matter what they tried to do, they couldn't pull off that magic because the consoles are just too old, and it's time for them to die. So I do think that ultimately it is a red flag when a game constantly gets delayed, that there is just a fundamental problem with the overall design philosophy behind the game, and that it doesn't matter how long they develop a game, just the magic is not there, and they just can't, they can't pull a rabbit out of the hat, you know what I mean? But if it just simply comes down to a publisher underestimating the timetable it will take, and that they thought it was going to take this long, but it actually takes a little bit longer, and they don't delay it, or they're afraid of delaying it because it's going to kill the hype. I think the best way of mitigating that is to just do what Bethesda does, even though Bethesda might not be the best example, because even though they don't announce release dates until a few months before, think of every game, Fallout 4, Skyrim, every single major release Bethesda made had fundamental flaws to it, but keep in mind, it was also because those games were running on a terrible, terrible outdated engine that really can't handle most of the stuff that Bethesda wants to do. And I'm talking about the Creation engine, or the Gamebryo engine, which is 20 years outdated. It's time to move on from that. So yeah, I mean, I think when a game has a lot of fundamental problems, it just has to do with how the game is designed, and delays might not be the solution to all the problems when we're talking about that, right? But I think if the idea is great and they just need to have more time with it, especially when we're talking about big AAA publishers that definitely have the financial resources to keep a project going on longer than they usually do, especially like you have games like Assassin's Creed, they had annual releases year after year after year, and it was getting to a point where the game would launch and it was obviously not ready. But what did they do? Eventually, they changed the way Assassin's Creed was developed. They gave it a 2-year cycle instead of a 1-year cycle, and it did wonders for the Assassin's Creed series. But I still don't agree with the whole idea of like having a schedule, like a set schedule for a game, because I think that obviously hurts the quality of that game. Like Call of Duty, every single year there's a new COD, every single year, and there's a reason why we had a lot of shitty CODs over the years, because they were rushed and they were not ready. I think one of the big problems in the gaming industry today is the way that they schedule releases, especially the annual releases, because even if the games are not bad, it's just you create higher expectations year after year after year after year after year, that the game kind of overstays its welcome. The series kind of gets stale. So maybe games like Call of Duty should get delayed just so that people have breathing room to appreciate the series a lot more than if they just get shoved down their throat every single fucking year. I think that's a big reason why there's a lot of fatigue in the Call of Duty series, even though, I mean, to be fair though, Modern Warfare sold a shit ton. Cold War, I think, is selling well, so they're making money. I can't really argue that they need to change their business practices, because they're making a lot of fucking money. So who am I? I'm just some random jerk-off on YouTube, right? But I think if a developer, publisher, whoever calls the shots, whoever's in charge, if they can't deliver upon releasing a quality product on release day, then they should not announce that release date. I don't care if they underestimated it. It definitely leaves a bad taste in people's mouths when the game keeps getting delayed and delayed and delayed, especially when after it gets delayed all these times it still doesn't, it's not up to snuff like Cyberpunk 2077. So I think even though Bethesda's games are fucked up, they have it right where they just say, hey, we're working on this game, we're not going to give you a release date like the Elder Scrolls 6, like we're not going to give you a release date, but we're working on the game. Even though Bethesda's not a good example because their games are fucking broken and buggy, I think they at least have the right idea when it comes to building hype and marketing a game, is that they don't really go heavy into the marketing until it's like a few months before release date. I think that's the best way to go about it to avoid problems with delay, because if it's like 3 months before the game's supposed to come out, you have a better idea of how long it's going to take than if you announce a release date 6 months to a year before you're supposed to release it. So that's what I think about video game delays. I think sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and just automatically, just because a game is delayed doesn't inherently mean it's going to be a better quality product than a game that may take less time. I think it ultimately comes down to the vision that a game has rather than how long it actually takes for that game to be developed. I think if the vision of the game is fundamentally flawed, then a delay isn't going to save it. But I think if a game just needs a little bit more time for quality assurance, or maybe to add a few more features to make it a refined experience, I think always delay the game at that point. Always do it. I don't care what the circumstances are. The game would be so much better. And even if that doesn't make the most financial sense for them to delay a game, especially after the holiday season where most of the money can be made, I think if we're talking about the quality of a video game as an art form rather than a business endeavor, it's definitely very worthwhile for a delay to happen. And even if we're just talking business, I don't think it's sustainable in the long term to just keep releasing broken messes and fix them later on, and people are just going to be cool with that. I think something's got to give eventually. People are not going to be rushing to buy games new if they know that it's going to take a while for it to be fixed, even after release. Especially with single-player games. There's definitely a lot more leeway when we're talking about online games, maybe not launching in a great state, but then improving over time because of the whole live service gimmick, and it's an online experience, okay. But with single-player games, it's a lot worse when a game is not ready on release day, especially if you spent your hard-earned money expecting it to be finished. I mean, that's not an unreasonable expectation. Even if we have patches and updates and shit, it's still reasonable to expect that the day you get a new product, it should function properly. But those are my thoughts on delays in the video game industry. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.